Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren, pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró.
Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio.
Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros nos dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta ahí, pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas?
Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí para cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
Revolución es sentido del momento histórico, es cambiar todo lo que debe ser cambiado, es igualdad y libertad plenas, es ser tratado y tratar a los demás como seres humanos, es emanciparnos por nosotros mismos y con nuestros propios esfuerzos. Es desafiar poderosas fuerzas dominantes dentro y fuera del ámbito social y nacional. Es defender valores en los que se cree, al precio de cualquier sacrificio. Es modestia, desinterés, altruismo, solidaridad y heroísmo. Es no mentir jamás ni violar principios éticos. Es convicción profunda de que no existe fuerza en el mundo capaz de aplastar la fuerza de la verdad y las ideas. Revolución es unidad, es independencia, es luchar por nuestros sueños de justicia para Cuba y para el mundo, que es la base de nuestro patriotismo, nuestro socialismo y nuestro internacionalismo.
Hello, happy Friday, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you're tuning in from, depending. We are the Revolution Within the Revolution, a national network on Cuba show that is hosted every single Friday. Every single Friday, you can find us here at this very channel. Please like, subscribe, and share. We want to ensure we're building our own independent media. I am so glad to join you all today. I am one of your hosts, Ermia Fanayan. I'm coming to you from the heart of the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C. One of my co-hosts, Onya Sanu, will also be joining us later in the show. But before that, we want to get into some of the things that we'll be discussing on today's show. So today we're going to go over some of Cuban history. We're going to go over some No War on Cuba campaign updates. We're going to also be talking about the life and legacy of Comandante Fidel Castro and what it is that he has taught us, the lessons that we've learned from his work leading the Cuban Revolution. And then we're going to end it off with some more updates on the network and other action items that you can partake in and get involved. But before that, we want to discuss our full solidarity with Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution. Today and every single day, we say free Maduro, free first combatant Celia Flores, and full solidarity with Venezuela. Just this past week, yet another sham trial has been held, another sham hearing had been held in the United States, in New York City, where Maduro is being held, where he was kidnapped from his sovereign nation as head of state and brought into the city. And this was now his third sham hearing within this year. So every single day we say release Maduro and full Venezuelan sovereignty now. Now moving on to the next portion of the show, we like to do a day in Cuban history every single episode, talking about what happened on this day. But since we won't have a show on Sunday, we wanted to highlight the anniversary of July 26th. July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro led roughly 130 to 160 rebels in a bold strike against the Moncada barracks, where one of the dictator Batista's vital military infrastructures were being held. And this was indeed the spark that ignited the Cuban Revolution. When Fidel was captured and put on trial after this attack, a sham trial, he gave his momentous speech where he stated that history will absolve him. Ultimately, this inspired the masses of Cubans and made him a popular leader to this day. So July 26th is a major holiday in Cuba. People all over the island put up July 26th memorabilia all year long, and they incorporate it into every part of Cuban culture and society. It's like Christmas in Cuba, essentially. And of course, commemorating Fidel Castro and the July 26th movement is very fitting, as today we will be talking about the lessons we have learned from him. But before that, Comrade Onyesanu, we're going to bring you on to give us some updates on the No War on Cuba campaign.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Ermia, for that wonderful welcome. We're going to see Comrade Ermia again in a moment when we get into the lessons from Fidel. But a lot has been going on in terms of the escalation of the U.S. government's genocidal war against the Cuban people. And we definitely want to check in about that, as well as what the resistance is doing in response. So, of course, the biggest news of this week in terms of U.S. propaganda war against Cuba and also against progressive forces has been the release of the State Department's farce of a report, straight up nonsense of a report, over 100 pages of lying, perpetrating, misrepresenting the story, and attempting to frame Cuba as the architect of national liberation struggles, particularly African national liberation struggles across Turtle Island and across the world. They are basically accusing this nation, which on the one hand they call a failed state, of also somehow orchestrating a global conspiracy, being the true force behind multiple revolutionary struggles and organizations. We're basically all Cuban puppets. Before when Hillary Clinton was running for president, we were Russian puppets. But now that Cuba and Iran are public enemies number one in the eyes of the unhinged Trump administration, now Cuba is the puppet. So of course, the National Network on Cuba was named in that report. The Vencemos Brigade was named in that report. Zohan Mandani was named in that report. Democratic Socialists of America was named in that report. Code Pink, George Floyd, Hassan Piker. They were really just like throwing names out every which way and saying Cuba is the architect of all of this. None of these people, none of these organizations are thinking or acting for themselves. None of us are acting out of like a sense of principle or sense of right and wrong, saying that this cannot be allowed because we don't want 11 million people to be collectively punished for trying to build another way. No. What's really happening is like Cuban mind control, I guess, like Havana syndrome on a global scale, I guess, whatever. So the intent of this report is not to present any evidence for the allegations made by the State Department. The intent of this report is to attempt to escalate the media war against the Cuban Revolution, to frame Cuba as an existential threat to the United States, to justify military and economic attacks against the Cuban Revolution. And the intent of the report is to attempt to isolate not just Cuba Solidarity Forces, but anybody with progressive politics, really. Like they are trying to frame communism as an existential threat to the future of the US empire, which, you know, depending on your analysis of how we get to communism, it may be. However, the reality of the situation is that the economic system that the State Department and the US government uphold, capitalism, is the cause of destruction and devastation all over the world, is the driving force behind genocidal US economic policy targeting Cuba. They are terrified of the possibility of a alternative to capitalism emerging. Like that's why they can't let the Cuban Revolution go, because Cuba took itself back, liberated itself as a colony of US imperialism, and built a socialist revolution less than 100 miles off the coast of the United States, and proved under constant attack, constant economic, political, media, and now military attack, that they are able to survive, that they are able to sustain themselves, that they are able to meet the basic needs of their citizens in a way that capitalist governments with hundreds of times more resources have not been able to. So really what the State Department report is about is attempting to isolate and fearmonger and freak people out, to intimidate them away from fighting for alternatives, from fighting against imperialism, and from moving in solidarity with Cuba. And so we cannot allow ourselves to be distracted or scared or intimidated by these people's paranoid, rambling, can't stop, won't stop. The Centenary Fidel Brigade is continuing it as planned. Many different brigades are traveling to Cuba for the Centenary Fidel, and that's continuing as planned. We are going to bring material aid. We are going to be vocal and clear and uncompromising about our support for the Cuban Revolution, because we recognize what they're trying to do. And we also recognize that it's a desperate tactic. It's a desperate tactic. The reason why they're doing this, the reason why they're throwing everything at the wall, like I was talking to my comrade about like the tone of the report. And if I don't know if y'all have ever seen the meme of Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he has like the board with all the strings and he's like trying to explain. I forget what he was trying to explain, but he looked like he was out of his mind. And he's like pointing to the board with like a wild look on his face. Like that is the vibe that the State Department report gave me. They literally pulled from the darkest corners of the internet and threw out anything to try to frame Cuba as an existential threat, despite the US being the full antagonist in the situation. So I lost my straight train of thought, and I'm just going to be transparent that we are running on fumes over here on the last days before we depart for Cuba for the Centenary Fidel Brigade. So I apologize if I'm all over the place, but the point is, we don't care. We don't care. Y'all can just like point and rage into the wind. The work does not stop. We are in uncompromising solidarity with the Cuban people, with the Cuban Revolution. We are unapologetic communists. The NNOC is a big tent, and there are communists in it, and we love them. I'm a communist. I'm pretty sure Amia is a communist. Doesn't matter. We're going to build an alternative to capitalism because it is, in fact, a fight for the future of life on this planet. Cuba is building a sustainable way to live that must be defended. The capitalist, fascist, white supremacist, patriarchal politics that the U.S. is trying to impose upon the world are a dead end, are a death cult. So we don't care. Say what you want to say. The work does not stop. And to bring the focus back to what is truly important, which is U.S. attacks on the Cuban Revolution, I want to uplift a very important article by Comrade Danny Valdes of Cuban-Americans for Cuba. He also serves on the International Committee of the Democratic Socialists of Americas. But he published this article this week called "The Starve a Nation, Cuba's Latest Economic Shakeup" on Geese, a review of American communism, Geese magazine. I had never heard about it before Danny's article, but I love this website and I love this article because Danny has been to Cuba multiple times throughout the past couple of years, and he has been able to witness firsthand how conditions on the ground on the island have been drastically impacted by intentionally genocidal U.S. policy against the Cuban Revolution. And so in this article, he's talking about the reality of daily blackouts lasting 20 hours or more, the reality of the national power grid going down, the reality of how hospitals are being forced to operate under these conditions, the reality of how impactful it is upon the day-to-day lives of regular Cubans. Like, imagine living in 20 hours of no electricity daily. That means like your fridge don't work, so you can't have food past a couple of days. That means that your AC doesn't work and it's like 90 degrees and like 80% humidity. That means that you cannot charge your phone. That means that your internet doesn't work. That means so many different things about your day-to-day life are drastically impacted. And then when you leave your home and you're trying to get around the island, because there's been a total oil blockade imposed since January 26th of this year by the US government, that also means that you have to wait hours and hours and hours with dozens of people for a bus to get around. It means that a lot of the things that you expect to do in your day-to-day life are not available to you because they cannot generate the electricity they need to stay open. And so this is really important to highlight, to center that it is the US that is the antagonist, that is the aggressor in US-Cuba relations, that the Trump administration is carrying out an intentional policy of collective punishment, an intentional policy of genocide meant to starve the Cuban people, meant to suffocate them, meant to strangle them. And at the same time as the Trump administration is pursuing this policy, they are trying to say that Cuba is bringing it on itself. And so this is why it's so important that voices like Danny Valdes, voices like those in Cuban-Americans for Cuba, are uplifting the on-the-ground reality of U.S. policy against Cuba. It's not like evil communists, little Fidels that are being impacted. It's like regular, poor and working class people, over 10 million people, nearly 11 million people being impacted in this way by U.S. policy. And another really important thing that Danny Valdes highlights in this article is that we have to understand U.S. policy towards Cuba in this moment within the broader context of how the Trump administration is carrying out a right-wing counter-revolution across the Western Hemisphere. Progressive government after progressive government is falling in the face of coups architected by U.S. imperialism. Colombia was just the last one. The right-wing candidate won in the Colombian election, and immediately, and there was like a lot of election fraud, like multiple different vectors of election fraud that call those results into question. But nonetheless, the right wing took power, immediately withdrew Colombia from South Africa's case against Israel in the International Criminal Court, immediately singled the intent to engage in violent antagonism against progressive forces in Colombia and align themselves more closely with the United States. The same thing has happened in Peru. The same thing has happened in Honduras. They are deliberately attempting to destabilize Mexico internally so they can try to get Claudia Sheinbaum out. And so understand that what is happening to Cuba is happening within a context where the US government is attempting to stamp out all of the anti-imperialist, all of the socialist and progressive governments in Turtle Island, because they are seeking to make this their personal plantation. They are trying to stomp out any kind of resistance to US imperialism. And when you think about it in that context, which you should, then you have to understand that Cuba is one of the last remaining holdouts. Cuba maintains a revolutionary socialist and anti-imperialist government even in the face of escalating U.S. aggressions. And they are one of the last forces remaining in Turtle Island that is able to hold out. So Cuba cannot be allowed to fall, because a right-wing counter-revolution spanning the entire Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. is not excluded. We have a fascist government in power now. Do you understand that if every single progressive government falls, that is the front lines of our resistance against this? And if you do not believe that the tactics that they are carrying out in these global South nations will not be brought here, then you have not been paying attention to the news. Because right now, there is a number, like thousands of untrained, mostly men, many of whom have domestic violence charges and all kinds of mental illness, who have been deployed in streets and cities across the United States, who are gunning people down in the street, who are covering their faces and kidnapping people and disappearing them. It's already here. And so Cuba is part of the same fight. They are the holdouts. We cannot let Cuba fall. We cannot abandon Venezuela. We have to show up for Mexico, because the Trump administration is systematically taking out these left-wing governments. And once they're all gone, that is right-wing, the consolidation of right-wing power over our hemisphere. We cannot allow that. We cannot allow that. And progressive forces, Cuba Solidarity forces, anti-imperialist forces who are in the belly of the beast, who are fighting against us, have a very important strategic role to play. Just like the progressive forces across the nations of Turtle Island also have a very important strategic role to play. And I also want to say that though they have achieved electoral victories, they have pushed out many left-wing governments, and they are threatening other left-wing governments. The people in those nations are not accepting it. They're not taking it lying down. They are still organizing. They are still mobilizing. That's why they got a right-wing government in power in Bolivia, and the Bolivian people were like, we hate this guy. He sucks. We are shutting this shit down until he gets up out of here. And that's happening in many different nations. Even in Trinidad, I was talking to a comrade in the VB who works with progressive forces on the ground in Trinidad and Tobago. And she was saying, even though the president of Trinidad is like a Trump puppet, proud Trump puppet, celebrating when the U.S. military drone bombs her own citizens in the Caribbean Sea, no charges. That's still happening, by the way. Hundreds of fishermen have been murdered from the sky by the U.S. military. And the governments across Turtle Island, including the governments that these people are citizens of, are not saying anything or actively celebrating. So the president of Trinidad was like, yeah, kill more uncharged innocent people. And the people in Trinidad are like, what is your fucking problem? Girl, no, are like saying, we want relations with Cuba. We oppose what the U.S. military is doing. We oppose the relationship that this president has pursued with the U.S. government. So never abandon your faith in the people. Even when there's a right-wing coup that pushes the progressive government out of power, the masses of people remain and continue that struggle. And also, we have to defend the remaining left-wing governments, the remaining progressive, socialist, and anti-imperialist governments like Cuba. So shout out to Danny Valdes for putting this within the larger geopolitical context to understand that what's happening to Cuba cannot be understood in isolation. And we are continuing our work as the National Network on Cuba to build out that global No War on Cuba campaign that was born on the International Mayday Brigade this year. The next stop in our work is going to be a 24-hour global picket in defense of Cuba, starting tomorrow, July 25th, and concluding on Sunday, July 26th. Ermia already laid out the wonderful revolutionary Cuban history of July 26th, and we want to commemorate that. We want to uplift that. We want to learn from the example of what the Cuban people have done, because we have to wage our own revolutionary struggle against the forces of reaction here in the United States and across Turtle Island. So we are going to have 24 hours of solidarity activists, organizers, cultural workers, revolutionary leaders, and ideologues all showing up for 24 straight hours in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. Every time, every single time these Yankees, these imperialists escalate their attacks on the Cuban Revolution, we have to respond with a higher and higher level of solidarity and organization of solidarity forces. And so this global picket is going to feature people from Cuba, from Puerto Rico, from Mexico, from Azania, from Canada, from Burkina Faso, all raising their voices in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution and calling for no war on Cuba. We're going to live stream the 24-hour global picket on nowaroncuba.com. So please tune in at some point during this weekend, starting tomorrow, nowaroncuba.com, and support the Cuban Revolution. And then I think that's my last thing before I bring back Armia so we can talk about lessons from Fidel.
Amazing. Thank you, Comrade Onia, for that amazing breakdown of what we have coming up. And comrades, I think as we discuss, the work that lies ahead, it's also important for us to reflect on history, right? It's important for us to reflect on the lessons that we've learned from the Cuban Revolution, as well as, in particular, the legacy of Comandante Fidel. And I want to start off by saying that very few leaders have embodied the challenge of holding to a revolutionary project under relentless external pressure more than Fidel Castro has. And for nearly half a century, Comandante Fidel refused to abandon what he believed was the revolutionary path, despite extraordinary opposition from US and the reactionary forces of Latin America. So when Fidel Castro and the July 26 movement entered Havana in January 1959, Cuba was a profoundly backwards, unequal society at the time, right? Let us not forget, before Fidel's time, Cuba had become a playground for the US to do whatever it wanted. So, of course, the revolution, led by the Comandante and materialized by the masses of Cubans, immediately distributed land, launched literacy campaigns, nationalized major industries, and dramatically increased access to education and healthcare. And make no mistake, these revolutionary changes that we are constantly talking about, that we're constantly praising when it came to the Cuban Revolution, came with attacks, right? They came with attacks from the forces that wanted Cuba to go back to being a backwards US-controlled society. Within just 2 years, Cuba faced invasion during the Bay of Pigs, sabotage campaigns, hundreds of assassination attempts against Fidel, diplomatic isolation from much of the West, and, of course, an enduring US blockade, which has now lasted over 60 years. Many governments in that situation might have capitulated, right? We've seen this throughout history. We've seen a constant capitulation when times get rough. But Fidel did not. Instead, he doubled down on the socialist transformation of Cuba. Literally, when he was interviewed at this time, all the way up to his passing, he would tell reporters that no matter how much they attempted to attack him and the revolution, Cuba would never in a million years give up its socialism. The Comandante was an incredible example of what it means when we have to be uncompromising during times when compromise seems like the convenient route, right? And because the real test of our principle, our discipline, our ability to withstand the monster, which is the US empire, comes when holding those principles aren't convenient and they don't give us awards and applause. And for organizers of today's movements, one lesson stands out the most from Fidel's legacy, which is that we have a duty not to water down our revolutionary commitment, and we have to grow a spine in the face of repression and attacks. Yes, history reminds us that transformation of a society can never happen when we only ask for what is palatable to the capitalist, imperialist, patriarchal West, right? So we have to be able to not just study Fidel and study Ho Chi Minh and study Lenin, but we have to be able to also note their discipline, right? They certainly loved their people, but passion alone is not what won them victory and sustained their revolutions. We have to ask ourselves, what if Fidel didn't have a spine? What if he had simply decided it was becoming too hard to build socialism and decided to take an easy route? it would have resulted in the complete abandonment of his people and decades longer of his homeland turning into a colonial project for the US. And I know in these past few segments, Comrade Onye and I were talking about Comandante Fidel, but it's also important to note that as a part of his legacy, he ensured this culture of rejecting retreat and standing boldly in the face of imperialism was instilled among all Cubans and in every corner of Cuban culture and society. When we are in conversation with the Cubans, right, with the Cuban people, anytime we're on the island, they speak just as boldly as Fidel did. They were not going around scared or waiting for some other Fidel-like figure to come and lead them. They understand that it is their own duty to fight for their homeland. Literally, one of their most popular phrases in Cuban culture is patria o muerte, right? Patria o muerte, which means homeland or death. And so as I wrap up this section on the uncompromising dedication of Comandante Fidel, I want us to be clear that perhaps the biggest legacy that Comandante Fidel left behind was his ability to inspire a lasting revolutionary fervor among the people, even well after his passing. And this principled commitment, this ability to never be scared or back down, is something every organizer who is a part of any front of struggle must be practicing. If you are serious, which if you're in struggle, you must be, right? Then you have to look at Fidel's boldness and dedication to his people as the bar that we must all meet, right? He set the bar and it's high, but it's a type of commitment and principles that every organizer has a duty of meeting. And so with that, I pass it over to you, Onye, to talk about the next section.
Thank you so much, Ermia. That was beautiful. And when you're talking, it reminded me of back in March when we had the Week of Action in Defense of Cuba, culminating on the anniversary of the protests of Baracoa, where Antonio Maceo refused to negotiate with the Spanish on the principles of Cuba's national liberation struggle. And it really shows you that Fidel was born from a legacy that was like intrinsic to the Cuban independence movement. Like he wasn't like an aberration or like a superhero. He was a product of Cuba's struggle for liberation, and like that principle of like that uncompromising revolutionary principle is like an aspect of Cuba's independence movement, and it has been from the very beginning. So Fidel was like one of like the culminations of it. You know what I'm saying?
That's great. That's great.
All right, so yes. So one of the common criticisms, lies told about Fidel Castro was that he was a totalitarian dictator, that he ruled Cuba with an iron fist, that he was the sole decider of the direction of the Cuban Revolutionary Project. On its face, that is clearly absurd. One, because of what we just laid out, that Cuba had been fighting for its independence from imperialism, for colonialism, for centuries, building up to the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 with Fidel, with Che, etc. So off top, like there's not an indication in that history of collective mass resistance against exploitation, against imperialism, that would indicate that the Cuban people would accept at any point one guy repressing them. When Batista was in there as a US puppet, the Cuban people were fighting back relentlessly. When Spanish colonization and slavery dominated the island, the enslaved African people and the indigenous people that were the roots of the Cuban resistance were fighting back relentlessly. And so throughout the history of the Cuban struggle for liberation, you see the masses of Cuban people moving collectively, reaching a higher and higher level of consciousness, building a collective national identity rooted in dignity, rooted in resistance. And that is where Fidel Castro emerged from. If Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and the other comrades that were in the Sierra Maestra, that were in the Granma, were attempting to carry out a revolutionary struggle by themselves without the support of the masses of the Cuban people, that shit would have lasted 5 days max. They would have been immediately captured and executed. The reason why the Cuban Revolution has developed into a successful socialist project is because from the beginning, it had the mass support of the masses of Cuban people. And after they won that military victory in 1959, the first task of the Cuban Revolution as a project was to invest in the development of the Cuban people, to carry out that literacy campaign, to carry out the political and economic development of the Cuban people so they could be full participants in building the revolutionary project. Why would Fidel, if he was a dictator, if he was a totalitarian leader, invest in building up the power and capacity of the Cuban people to think for themselves and to act for themselves? Why would he do that if he was seeking to control them? But I want to talk about concrete examples that really show you that Fidel had never at any point acted as a single charismatic leader, that he was a product of a collective process of revolution and transformation, and that he, in his leadership of the Cuban Revolution as a project selected by the Cuban people, made sure that the Cuban Revolution developed in that collective way. So a really amazing, inspiring history is the contributions that Fidel Castro as a leader made to the queer and women's struggle for liberation within the context of the Cuban Revolution, and his really concrete anti-patriarchal practice. So Fidel famously called women's liberation a revolution within the revolution. And he was not just saying this because there's a lot of men who will say, I am against patriarchy. I am a feminist. I am an ally. Smash the patriarchy. Women need to lead. And then when it comes to like the actual practice, baby, it is lacking. It is lacking. They just be talking. They don't be doing. That was not Fidel. From the very beginning, women took positions of leadership within the armed revolutionary struggle, within the building of Cuban society after the victory of the military struggle, in the literacy campaign, in the rebel army, in the revolutionary government. And one of the key aspects of why women played that leadership role was because because they were acting, because they were participating in the revolution as a process, their consciousness was raising at the same time. It was their experiences as women within the revolutionary project, their participation, their accomplishments that helped build the consciousness they needed to understand their intrinsic worth as revolutionary actors and to understand their importance to the political project of the revolution. And Fidel himself, from his position of leadership, spoke frequently about the need for women to lead. But again, he didn't just talk. It's easy to talk. He also acted. So I want to read a quote from him, and I'm going to talk about how he acted. So he says in that speech, The Revolution Within the Revolution has really been two revolutions for women. It has meant a double liberation as part of the exploited sector of the country, and second, as women who are discriminated against not only as workers, but also as women. And that is Fidel Castro expressing a historical and dialectical materialist analysis of the oppression of women, understanding that within the class struggle, they are not just oppressed on the basis of being working class, they are oppressed on the basis of their gender. And in order to carry out a successful revolutionary project that transforms the conditions of all the people in the society, you have to understand precisely how they are oppressed, precisely how they are exploited, and carry out steps to struggle against that. So one of the key aspects of its anti-patriarchal practice, rooted in transforming that material reality, the material conditions of women as an oppressed gender and oppressed class, was supporting the organization and leadership of women. And this is like one of the key tells to see if like a man is about that life. Because the one thing I've noticed about the men that like speak anti-patriarchy and move patriarchy is that when women start organizing, they get really anxious. Because as oppressed people develop their consciousness, develop their organization, they also build their power. And as they build their power, they have the capacity to transform their conditions, to transform social relations that would take away power from men who are comfortable being anti-patriarchal in rhetoric, but are not being comfortable being anti-patriarchal in practice in terms of losing access to power or losing access to resources. But Fidel was not a man like that. He supported the founding of the Federation of Cuban Women. The Federation of Cuban Women is a mass organization of Cuban women founded in 1960. Vilma Esman, one of the leaders of the guerrilla struggle against Batistas and then a leader in the revolutionary government, was the first president of the Federation of Cuban Women. And then another really important institution in terms of the social revolution, the struggle against patriarchy in Cuba, was Senesex, which began in 1972 as a national sex education working group of the Federation of Cuban Women, and then would go on to become Senesex, the institution, in 1989. And the intent of the FMC, of Senesex, of the National Sex Education Working Group, were to help wage a cultural revolution against patriarchy, against the oppression of queer and trans people and women within the Cuban Revolution. Senesex lays it out in their mission. It's the development of a culture of sexuality that is full, pleasurable, and responsible, as well as to promote the full exercise of sexual rights. Oh my God, that's so progressive. And it was founded in 1972. So some of the work of Senesex is to train sexual therapists and educators across the island. It is specialized care for trans people, and it's also developing programs to educate and support liberation for queer and trans people in Cuba and everywhere. I'm going to read a quote from Mariela Castro-Espen, who is the current director of Senesex, talking in more detail about why the FMC and Senesex have done this. The experience of more than 2 decades of work within lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people from the scientific and humanistic perspective of Senesex allows us to ascertain that if society does not establish policies dedicated to the attention of such realities, these people will be permanent victims of different forms of violence all along their lives. The most common forms go from verbal aggression to exclusion from their family circle, to physical abuse, murder, and penalization in 76 countries, including the death penalty in 5 of them. This is one of the reasons for Cuba's commitment to the international movement against the penalization of the queer population and for the depathologization of transsexuality. Again, that's Mario Castro-Espen, director of Senesex, talking about why Senesex, why the FMC have gone so hard for queer and trans liberation alongside women's liberation. This is precisely because they have an understanding of how you transform society. You have to go at the reactionary attitudes and practices that we are indoctrinated into within capitalist, imperialist, and white supremacist culture. A socialist project is not just a project of economic transformation. It is also a project of ideological and political and personal transformation, transforming the way we think, transforming the way that we treat each other, transforming the way that we think about ourselves. So this is the work. And from the very beginning, Fidel Castro understood this as part of the work of the revolution. And in addition to supporting the organization and political power and leadership of women, the formation of these organizations and institutions that made the power of women and queer and trans people within the Cuban Revolution concrete and able to be expressed across society. They were not just satisfied with making institutions. They were not just satisfied with making the same thing. The Cuban Revolution, under the leadership of Fidel Castro, also was very scientific about tracking the progress in how the struggle for the liberation of queer and trans people, the struggle for the liberation of women was advancing. It wasn't enough for them to say, we're doing the right things. They also had to assess how well was this actually working. And one of my favorite examples of this is the thesis on the full exercise of women's equality released by the Communist Party of Cuba. It was written for their first party Congress in December 1975. And at that first party Congress, the Communist Party of Cuba basically assessed all aspects of Cuban society. The revolution was 16 years old at that point. And so the Communist Party wanted to understand what are the principles and goals of the revolution and how effective are we in carrying out those principles and goals. They produced a number of different theses, a number of different papers and resolutions assessing all aspects of Cuban society, assessing all aspects of the development of the revolution. And so the thesis on the full exercise of women's equality is part of that assessment. It's part of that assessment. And so it has it's really, really long. And it's I'm going to drop the PDF for this book in a second. But one of my favorite parts of it is a section called the objective and subjective elements that impede the full participation of women. And what happens in that section is the Communist Party looks at different aspects of the condition of women within Cuban society, the participation of women within the Cuban Revolution, and also what are the specific aspects still existing in Cuban society, whether it's structural things, attitudes, lack of resources, etc., that are impeding the fuller participation of women in the revolution. And there's a section within that section talking about what is holding women back from their full participation in the revolution, where they talk about housework. They talk about housework as an unjust overload on women, and the fact that even though women were playing more and more of a role within the revolution, they were still expected to be the primary givers of childcare, the primary caretakers of sick and elderly persons within the family, the primary person who was cooking the food, doing the cleaning, doing the laundry, doing the shopping. And so the men were out in the field, being like full communist, fist up. And the women were trying to do that too, but they also had this entire other full-time job. A lot of them. And the Communist Party of Cuba was like, well, that's not going to work. And so there's like charts and tables laying out like how much of women's capacity is tied up in this work. And they're like, this is how many women are impacted. This is how they're impacted. And what are the ways that we can address this? Well, let's have like free laundry centers where the women can drop off the washing, that someone else who's paid to do that will do it, and the women can go to her job. They talk about like collectivizing childcare, collectivizing care of elders. A couple of times on the show, we've talked about the collective homes for elders in Cuba, where they get round-the-clock care, where they get socialization and enrichment, where they're held up as like part of the community. Like that is a way of collectivizing care that had previously been on the shoulders of women that were trying to be full agents within the revolution. And I feel so excited about this because again, there's so many progressive forces, progressive parties that have a lot of rhetoric about the liberation of women. But when it comes to even the women within their own ranks, they're not doing this kind of assessment to understand our conditions. They're not doing this kind of assessment to understand how to transform their conditions. They're just fucking talking. So from the beginning, you see the collective nature of the Cuban Revolution, but also a very scientific commitment to transformation, like laying out step by step how we're going to try to do this, and then laying out step by step how we're going to assess how well we did at this so we can do even better. My God, like that is a deep-rooted commitment to the liberation of women. That is, again, something that came from the very top, that came from Fidel's example, that came from the collective history of Cuba's national liberation movement. And the last thing I'll say in this section is just like, I want to uplift that Cuba has like a history of patriarchy. Cuba has a history of machismo, and Fidel Castro was very much a part of that. And he also took public accountability for it. He practiced vulnerability that is unheard of, quite frankly, unheard of for cishet men, and publicly took accountability for his contributions to patriarchal and queer antagonistic culture within the revolution. I'm talking about the UMAPs, the military units to aid production. Some context about the UMAPs. When the military victory of the Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, that was just the beginning of building out that project. They then had to undertake the work of transforming the whole of society, of building new institutions, of passing new legislation, of transforming the conditions of society across an entire island. That required the mobilizing of the entire population to build that project. And so the UMAPs emerged from there. They basically were a way where folks who were deemed unfit for military service, whether it was insufficient education, religious objections, or because of patriarchy and machismo, folks who were queer, gay men, were not eligible for the military draft, and instead were sent to the UMAPs. And the UMAPs were basically meant to be a way where folks who were not eligible to the military could still contribute to the collective development of Cuban society. However, because there was that patriarchy, that machismo in Cuban culture that was in the Cuban Revolution as well, the unfortunate reality was there was queer antagonism and very violent and abusive and harmful behavior to queer men, gay men who were in the UMAPs. So from 1965 to 1968, the UMAPs operated under military oversight. But there were like rumors throughout Cuban society of mistreatment of folks in the UMAPs, particularly queer men, gay men. And so from 1967 to 1968, the Cuban Communist Party and Fidel Castro undertake an investigation of these complaints. The Cuban government sent 100 undercover communist youth to document abuses within the UMAP. The youth went there, they saw it was true, they wrote it down, they said, this is messed up, this is not what the revolution is about. However, we believe in the capacity of the revolution to do better. This is a quote directly from the report. We won't leave Cuba. We'll stay and make what is bad not bad. So they were like, this is fucked up. This is patriarchal. This is homophobic, violently queer antagonistic. And this does not define what the revolution is. This is something that we have to struggle against, that we have to stop, and that we have to transform. So the UMaps were eventually closed as a direct result of this investigation and this report. Once systemic mistreatment was confirmed in 1968, the UMaps were closed. But then later on, Fidel Castro gave an interview to El País, or hold on, it's not El País, it's the Jornada, which is like a progressive Mexican outlet. And this is a Spanish language article, but I'll put it in the chat and perhaps you can Google Translate. However, he gave an interview to this publication where he is like reflecting upon this history. And he says, without question, there was not only homophobia within the revolution. I can tell you for sure there was prejudice against homosexuals. This is a direct quote. But he also says that I was complicit in this culture, that I was responsible for why this happened. And I take accountability for being complicit in the persecution of gay men, of homosexual people in Cuba. So this is like years later, after the investigation happened, after the UMaps were closed, after the practice was transformed, Fidel Castro reflecting upon his own role and taking accountability in public, in the press, and saying, I dropped the ball. I was a part of that. And that is like such a key part of revolutionary transformation, of anti-patriarchal struggle. It's not just saying patriarchy is wrong, it's examining our own actions, our own contributions to the oppression of women, the oppression of queer and trans people, and taking public inventory about that, taking public accountability for it. He was at that time a very, very respected figure within the Cuban Revolution. He still is. And so imagine the significance of taking responsibility in this way, of saying that we need to do better. Like that is like over and over and over again, you see the example of Fidel, of him holding himself to the same standards that he asked the Cuban people to in order to build this revolutionary project. And so understand the Cuban Revolutionary Project, socialism as Cuba, as a process of collective transformation, initially led by Fidel and carried out by the Cuban people to eliminate backwardness, to eliminate the oppression of queer and trans people in the Cuban Revolution and beyond, to eliminate the oppression of women, and really to transform the whole of society beyond the island. And because of this commitment to transformation that was part of the Cuban Revolution from the beginning, that was a key part of Fidel's example, because of the work of the Federation of Cuban Women, the work of Vilma Espen, the work of Cinesex, all of these things and the seeds they laid for transformation with Cuban society created the conditions for Cuba's top-tier response to the HIV/AIDS pandemic from the very beginning, and also created the conditions for the passing of the 2022 Family Code, one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in the world. And again, it was Fidel's example that helped light the way. And I'm going to pass it to Ermia for the next part.
Amazing. Thank you, Comrade Onye. And I also want to emphasize that the quote that Comrade Onye read, "Revolution within the revolution," is what our show is named after, because in our own organization, right, the leadership of women and gender oppressed people is incredibly important, right, and inevitable. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well. And comrades, I think that one thing that has probably been the most clear in today's presentation is that history doesn't remember those who waited for perfect conditions. It remembers those who were bold and decided to take risks, right? And every generation, not just Fidel's generation, but every generation faces a choice, which is to either accept the world as it is or take risks to build a new world. And the Cuban Revolution and the legacy of Comandante Fidel offers one of the clearest examples of the power in our ability to be bold and to decide that our values as a people's struggle isn't something we are willing to slip on. Let's not forget that in the 1950s, before the revolution happened, political opposition was violently suppressed, right? Political opposition against Batista. Corruption was widespread, and much of the country's wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small white elite, while many Cubans lived in poverty. And against this backdrop, Fidel Castro and a relatively small group of revolutionaries had decided that another world was in fact possible. And yes, they did indeed face overwhelming odds. They experienced defeat, imprisonment, exile, and setbacks that would have convinced many people to give up. After the failed attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953, it would have been easy to conclude that the movement was over. But instead, Fidel famously declared, and I quote, "History will absolve me," declaring his confidence that ideas could in fact outlast temporary defeats. And the spirit that Fidel exudes is one of the revolution's enduring lessons, right? Success is rarely immediate. Movements often encounter failures long before they achieve victories. But the willingness to continue, the willingness to be bold, is ultimately what creates a revolutionary society. And when Fidel and his fighters possessed few weapons and little certainty that they would prevail, they still built a relationship with rural communities. They still organized politically as well as militarily, and they steadily expanded their influence. The revolution succeeded not because its participants believed victory was absolutely guaranteed, though we now understand it was certainly inevitable, but because they believed it was worth the risk regardless of the outcome. And movements for national liberation, anti-colonial struggles, campaigns against apartheid, labor organizing, and countless grassroots efforts, you can name it, any front of struggle, have drawn inspiration from the idea that determined people can challenge systems that seem untouchable. And by and large, it has been the Cuban Revolution to instill this idea in many people across the world. And Fidel Castro embodied this belief in his political commitment. Through his leadership, he consistently argued that revolutionary politics required a discipline, education, and confidence that history could be shaped through collective struggle. And for those of us who are involved in organizing today, perhaps the most important lesson is not to imitate another revolution mechanically, but instead it's that every society has its own conditions, its own culture, and its own democratic traditions. And we should instead focus on the lesson to imitate the willingness to act with conviction. That is what we need to be imitating instead. So too often, politics in America, as we know, right, it rewards caution above all else. We are encouraged to lower our expectations. We are encouraged to moderate our demands before negotiations for what we can fight for even begins. And we are told that we have to accept incremental change as the limit of what is possible. But history repeatedly shows that many changes, once dismissed as unrealistic, then become inevitable. And that is one of the reasons the Cuban Revolution, I think, continues to resonate with many activists around the world today. Beyond its specific policies, right? As we know, as Comrade Onye just laid out, the policies and their particulars are incredibly important and inspiring for many revolutionary people. But beyond its specific policies, it represents a belief that ordinary people possess the capacity to transform society through determination, organization, and sacrifice. And I also want to emphasize this one point, that risk, when we talk about taking risk for our values, right? This risk should not be confused with adventurism or recklessness. The lesson is not that movements should seek conflict for its own sake, for conflict's sake. What they should recognize is that meaningful change is, it inevitably carries costs, right? It carries some kind of costs with it, especially at this time when we can see that repression against our movements has amped up. This is no secret, right? So trying to avoid every risk means surrendering our values before the struggle even begins. Fidel often spoke about confidence in future generations, which I think is very important. He believed political education was as important as political practice, because movements survive only when new generations inherit both principles and purpose. And I think that lesson remains incredibly relevant today. Our responsibility is not merely to remember history, but to study it critically, learn from its successes and failures, and continue building organizations that are capable of addressing the challenges of our own time. History, as we know, it belongs to those who dare to imagine a different future, right? It belongs to the working class and oppressed because we are the ones who actually fight for it. And the revolution proved that organized conviction can, in fact, become a greater force than numbers alone. So I want to end off with this one point, which is whatever our particular struggle, whatever it may be, the women's struggle, the working class struggle, the anti-imperial, whatever the struggle may be, one of the most enduring lessons that we can draw from the Cuban Revolution and from Comandante Fidel's legacy is that transformative change begins when people are willing to take meaningful risks and put something important on the line, right? And so I now pass it over to you, Comrade Onye.
Thank you so much, Ermia. Just to wrap it up, we wanted to talk about solidarity brigades, like the Meiji Brigade, like the Vencemos Brigade, like the Friendship Caravans with our comrades at Pastors for Peace, and like the many delegations that go with many NNOC member organizations should be understood as part of Fidel Castro's legacy, as part of his contribution to the global struggle for justice and part of the Cuban Revolution's collective contribution to the global struggle for justice. Solidarity brigades are internationalism in practice. They are collective, direct action against imperialism. It is people from all over the world, including from within the belly of the beast, taking action with their bodies to oppose U.S. aggression against people's movements for justice in Cuba and all over the world. And the Vencemos Brigade, which is one of my political homes, one of like the most important and impactful experiences that I had personally, and also like the most important and impactful political work that I have ever done, was actually inspired directly by Fidel Castro. In 1969, members of the Students for a Democratic Society were in Cuba seeking to find out how folks living in the United States and North America more broadly could take action in support of the Cuban Revolution in the face of US government policies attacking Cuba. And they were like, a lot of folks are being occupied in the zafra, in the sugar harvest right now. Maybe we can take jobs in like industrial positions or whatever. And Fidel was like, no, come here and cut. If you want to help, come here and cut sugarcane. And the folks from SES were like, okay, let's do it. And they took a brigade of, at that time, 260 people. They traveled from Mexico on a barge to Cuba and cut sugarcane alongside Fidel and Cuban workers all across the island to attempt to hit a particular sugar quota, a particular number for the sugar harvest. And so that is a part of the brigade's legacy, that solidarity labor, that showing up with an attitude of humility, of collectivism, to work side by side with the Cuban people to contribute materially to their revolution. The Vencemos Brigade is, of course, traveling to Cuba with our comrades in the National Network on Cuba next week for the Centenary of Fidel Brigade. It will be the 54th contingent of the Vencemos Brigade, and we truly would not exist without the contributions of Fidel Castro. It literally was his idea. For us, he was like, if y'all want to help, this is how you can help. And we were like, bet. And we have not stopped since. We have brought over 10,000 people to Cuba from the United States to see the reality of the Cuban Revolution, to humanize the Cuban people, to humanize the Cuban Revolutionary Project, to help people understand that all of the things that we hear about Fidel, all of the things that we hear about Cubans are not true, that they are in fact building a beautiful revolutionary project that is surviving under constant attack, that is a model for the entire world. We have so much to learn from Fidel Castro's legacy, from the Cuban people, from the Cuban Revolution, and then the brigades are a really, really wonderful way that we can do so directly, face-to-face, people-to-people. So just wanted to share a little bit of history of the VB. Shout out to the Zafra, shout out to Comandante Fidel Castro, shout out to the comrades from the Students from a Democratic Society, who, by the way, are still around and are still actively engaged in Cuba solidarity work. We would not have been able to go 50 years plus without the seed sown by those comrades. But I'm going to start taking us to the closing of the show because it's almost that time. So I'm going to bring us to our calls to action. So first and foremost, like I said, the Centenary of Fidel Brigade is departing to Cuba next week. We are bringing a brigade of folks from the U.S. to the island. We don't care what Marco Rubio says. We don't care what the State Department says. We are going regardless. We will never stop. No matter how you attempt to intimidate us, no matter how you attempt to repress us, we are prepared to resist, and we will continue taking people from the United States to Cuba to bring material aid, to engage in solidarity labor, and to engage in people-to-people exchange with our Cuban comrades to learn about how they have built this wonderful revolutionary project. So if you would like to support the work of the Centenary Fidel Brigade, you still have the opportunity to do so. The QR code to the screen will take you to our national fundraiser where we are raising funds to bring as much material aid as possible. We already were able, thanks to your donations, to provide partial scholarships to all the folks in the brigade that applied for financial assistance. So shout out to y'all. We have also been able to get multiple pallets of prescription medication and medical supplies that are going to come with us to Cuba. And so thank you so much for all the work that has happened around the country to raise funds, to gather material aid, to educate people about the truth about the Cuban Revolution and U.S. policy towards Cuba. We are almost there. We are so close. I am so excited to leave this place. Oh my God. And we have like a brigade that's like packed with hitters, packed with revolutionaries, packed with strong comrades. So if you want to help push us over the finish line, you can scan that QR code, donate to our national fundraiser. And our comrades at IFCO Pastors for Peace are also going to be in Cuba for the Centenary of Fidel. They are also a key member organization within the National Network on Cuba. They have been bringing brigades to Cuba in the face of resistance for as long as we have, just fighting side by side. So we definitely want to direct support to them as well. They have met their goal. Shout out to IFCO for meeting that 60K goal to bring a shipping container to Cuba. But if you want to continue to help them contribute, help them bring even more aid, I dropped a link in the chat to IFCO's fundraiser. An additional opportunity to act in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution this weekend is, of course, the 24-hour virtual global solidarity picket organized by the National Network on Cuba in defense of Cuba. That once again is starting tomorrow, Saturday, July 25th at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. UTC. You can tune in to the 24-hour live stream. Yes, 24-hour live stream at nowaroncuba.com. We're going to have folks from Burkina Faso, from Niger, from Azania, from Puerto Rico, from Mexico, Cuba Solidarity Forces from Canada, from all over the planet, united in action on the virtual picket in defense of Cuba. So again, tune in, nowaroncuba.com. You can tune in at some point over 2 days, right? Like an hour here, 30 minutes there, or lock in, get your snacks, and join us for that full 24 hours, again, starting tomorrow. So I'm going to bring back Comrade Ermia, and we're going to move to the close of the show. Thank you all so much for watching. We appreciate you very much. Let me bring back. Are you back? Did it freeze? Oh, maybe I put you in the wrong place. Or maybe I'm in the wrong place. I am.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, comrades. Thank you for watching and tuning in. Again, this is Revolution Within the Revolution. We are here every single Friday. So please, please, please like, subscribe, share the show. We need to continue building our own independent media. And we will be here next week. We'll be talking about the centennial of Fidel and its send-off, because the day after, Comrade Onia is going to be on a plane to Cuba. So please, please, please join us. And of course, as always, we say Cuba sí.
Bloqueo no.
Viva
la Revolución Cubana.
That's right. We'll get better at these cultural sign-offs, I promise y'all. Awesome. Thank you, comrades, and we'll see you next week.
Preocupado el presidente anaranjado,
que se apuro